The eastern slope of the Bitterroot Range, late 19th century. While other settlers were busy reinforcing their cabin doors and praying the slope above would stay quiet through the winter, Elias Rowen started building something no one in the valley had ever seen. He drove massive wooden stakes into a V shape pointed straight up the hill, placed them a distance from his cabin that many considered pointless, and braced every joint as if preparing for an inevitable impact. Neighbors called it a snow-viewing fence. They called him a reckless fool. They said that if an avalanche really came down, no arrangement of timber could save a house in the slide path. Still, Elias kept working, fine-tuning the angle of the V, reinforcing the load-bearing posts and clearing the space behind it while the head-shaking grew more frequent. Then that winter built to a dangerous extreme. Snow fell without pause, wind piled deep layers high up, and the entire slope began emitting low, muffled sounds as if breaking itself apart from the inside. In the other cabins, people heard snow shifting in the night, doors rattling under pressure, and every morning they opened them, fearing the sight of a fresh slide path forming. But in front of Elias's cabin, where the V-shaped barrier was dismissed as folly, the snow did not pile up in the usual way. It was forced to split, deflected, leaving a cold, empty space behind that no one yet dared call safe. What had he understood about terrain, momentum, and the way snow chooses its path that everyone else dismissed as blind gambling? Elias Rowen had come to that valley years earlier, carrying experience from high mountains and a way of seeing avalanches that his neighbors took a long time to mock. Elias Rowen grew up in the northern mountains of the continent, where winter did not arrive in romantic flurries but in dense masses of frigid air that swept down the slopes like saw blades, and he learned early that a single barrier rarely stopped what terrain and gravity had already decided. His father had worked in winter logging camps where men did not build straight walls against snow but angled timbers into sloped faces that forced wind and snow to slide off to the sides instead of hitting head-on. Elias himself, once old enough to work, spent years on trans-mountain railroad crews, cutting paths through slopes where snow never stayed still. There he saw, time and again, that an avalanche did not behave like a wall that collapsed and stopped, but like a heavy fluid mass that followed the land, splitting itself when it met obstacles and bending around any shape that forced it to choose. An old accident burned that lesson into his memory. A temporary workers' shelter built below a slope where everyone believed it was safe because there had never been an avalanche was swept away in seconds when a slab above let go. But the next morning, when the rescue party reached the site, they found that right behind a natural V-shaped rock outcrop, the ground remained bare, unburied, as if the snow flow had reached that point and been forced to split and slide past on both sides. No one called it a miracle, but Elias never forgot. He understood that an avalanche was not an enemy that could be halted by strength or thickness, but a moving flow that had to be forced to divert if one wanted to survive beside it. Years later, when Elias staked out his cabin in a narrow valley on the eastern flank of the Bitterroot Range, that memory returned clearer than ever. The valley, seen from a distance, appeared gentle and peaceful, but to someone who could read terrain, old avalanche paths still showed on the slopes like faint scars, enough to say the place had never been truly safe. Elias's cabin sat squarely in the runout zone, the area where slides from above typically came to rest, compacting into dense masses that destroyed anything in their way. Locals called that spot "never hit yet," a phrase that served both to reassure themselves and to avoid facing the fact that what had not happened did not mean it would not happen. That winter came earlier than usual. Heavy snow fell in waves. Temperatures hovered around freezing so layers did not bond properly, and high winds built large, swollen, fragile cornices just waiting for a small change to release. Elias watched it all in silence. He did not panic, but he did not lull himself with luck either. He knew he could not move a finished cabin, could not dig a trench deep enough to withstand the kinetic energy of thousands of tons of moving snow, and certainly could not erect a straight wall and hope it held when the entire slope came down. A straight wall only created a single impact point where all the force concentrated. A deep trench only became a trap when filled in seconds, and leaving meant admitting humans had no place here. Instead of those options, Elias returned to the principle that had followed him for years, the vive, a structure not meant to stop the snow, but to split the force, deflect the flow, and create behind it a shadow zone where snow, having lost momentum, could no longer crush anything in its path. If you could not stop the flow, make it choose two other directions. It was not philosophy. It was simple physics learned through blood and memory. When his log cabin was finished by late summer, solid and chinked like every other in the valley, neighbors nodded, assuming Elias was finally done building his home, and would move on to cutting firewood or clearing trails before the big snows. Instead, he began driving massive posts into ground already stiffening with frost, arranging them into two widening wings that converged at a point aimed straight up the slope. The distance from the Vi's apex to the cabin he measured again and again, far enough that the two deflected streams would lose power before reaching his dwelling, yet close enough to prevent them from merging again into a single mass. The angle of the Vi was calculated carefully, not too narrow that snow would pile high and spill over, not too wide that it lost its splitting effect. The laughter started in the first days. People called it the viewing fence, wasted timber, the suicide wedge, because in their view avalanches did not turn aside, and if one did come, that structure would only ensure Elias died exactly where he had chosen to stand. Caleb Monroe, who had lived in the valley longer than anyone, mocked it most openly. He leaned on his own fence, watched Elias pound posts, shook his head, and said loudly enough for others to hear that no fence could teach snow where to go. Elias offered no defense, no long explanations, no attempt to persuade with words. He simply kept working. He drove posts deeper than usual, so they would not pop out when snow pressed down, braced the apex to take the initial impact, and checked every angle as if preparing for a test he could not retake. Day after day the sound of his hammer echoed through the valley, mingling with laughter and comments that the man was building something strange and useless. To Elias none of that mattered anymore. What needed to happen had long ago been decided between snow, gravity, and the shape of the mountain, and his only job was to complete a structure honest enough that when nature rendered judgment, the outcome would be clear, right or wrong. The first slide came not in the dramatic way people imagined disaster, no explosive roar, no sky collapsing in a single instant, but through a series of signs. Only those who have lived long enough with mountains recognize wind shifting late in the afternoon, air suddenly heavy as if pressed against the ground, and an unnatural silence settling over the valley, where even birds and people stopped all unnecessary activity. Elias recognized it early, not with fear but with attention honed over years. The snow above his cabin had built thick enough, old layers iced over alternating with fresh loose falls that had not bonded, forming an unstable slab needing only a small trigger to start moving. When it happened, the sound was not thunder, but a deep prolonged growl that spread along the slope and rolled down into the valley like a runaway freight train. Neighbors who heard it stepped outside their cabins, stood at a safer distance, and looked in the same direction where a large slab began to move, slowly at first, then accelerating, pulling powder snow, ice chunks and broken branches torn from the slope. No one ran. No one was close enough to be caught, and this slide did not look big enough to kill. It felt more like an early season test than a final blow. The snow came down the old path, heading straight for Elias's area, and in the first seconds the onlookers believed they were about to see further proof that nothing stops snow once it starts. Then the mass hit the apex of the V. That moment produced no loud crash, no spectacular image like in stories told later, only a subtle but unmistakable change in how the snow moved. Instead of piling force at one point and spilling over, the flow began to split. Like water meeting the bow of a boat, most of the mass forced to either side into two distinct streams, each hugging one arm of the barrier before continuing downward on diverging paths. The energy did not vanish instantly, but it was no longer concentrated. It was dispersed, stretched across space, and that alone weakened it. Snow continued another several dozen yards, but by the time it neared the cabin, the two streams had lost enough momentum to no longer crush. They settled into two high piles, one left and one right, while the space immediately behind the apex, where Elias's cabin stood, remained bare, covered only in a thin dusting like frost. From a distance the scene looked almost unreal, a clean void between two tall snow walls, as if someone had drawn a boundary snow was not allowed to cross. Elias did not rush outside. He stood inside the cabin, listening as the sound faded, feeling the ground vibration die away, then opened the door and stepped out. Before him was the result of what he had believed and built, not as a triumphant victory, but as stark reality. The structure still stood, the cabin untouched, and the snow had followed exactly the path physics allowed when forced to choose. The neighbors watching from afar did not cheer, nor did they approach right away. There were no apologies, no public admission that Elias had been right, because what they had witnessed was not large enough to force them to abandon thinking rooted over years. This slide had killed no one, destroyed no homes, and so it could still be attributed to luck, to a minor wind shift, or to the snow not being enough yet. But the laughter stopped. A silence spread through the valley, lasting longer than the sound of the slide itself, a heavy silence because it carried questions no one was ready to ask aloud. Elias said nothing. He did not explain, did not point at the barrier, did not demand anyone look closer. He simply stood for a moment, surveying the two tall snow piles on either side, like walls erected by the very snow that had been deflected, then turned back inside and closed the door, as if what had just happened was only one step in a long sequence. The winter had not yet finished. After the first slide, once the snow lay settled in two high piles on either side, and the valley returned to heavy stillness, the story did not remain mere impression or rumor, but began shifting into something slower and harder to deny. Margaret Hale arrived the next morning, riding her familiar thin horse along the snow-covered trail. She was the valley's only teacher, holding classes in months when roads were still passable, and the only one who kept regular weather records for years, not out of curiosity, but from a habit formed when she was asked to send reports to an office downstream. Margaret was not close to Elias, nor had she taken his side in the rare conversations among households. She preferred working with dates, numbers, and observations that did not require hasty conclusions. She dismounted at a respectful distance, took from her leather bag a wooden ruler, a hard-covered notebook, and a worn pencil, and began measuring. First, she measured snow depth right in front of the V apex, where the initial mass had struck and been forced aside, noted the figure, and marked the spot. Then she moved to the two arms of the barrier, measuring the height of the compacted piles like rough walls, where snow was packed so tight the ruler made a dry sound when pushed in. Finally, she stepped into the area, immediately behind the barrier, the shadow zone Elias called it, and measured the thin layer covering the ground, where rock and dry grass showed under the pale morning winter light. Margaret did everything in silence, simply recording, comparing, and moving on. Then she rode to another cabin in the same runout zone that had no deflection structure and repeated similar measurements, noting considerably greater depth and uniform compaction of a mass that had stopped from loss of energy rather than diversion. Returning to Elias's area, Margaret closely examined the physical traces the slide had left. Young trees snapped in two diverging directions, not parallel, as in straight slides, the two high snowbanks with rough, hard surfaces, and the ground right behind the apex showing almost no sign of heavy compression. She sat on a fallen log, opened her notebook, and sketched a simple diagram showing the barrier position, slide direction, two snow streams, and the clear zone behind, alongside numbers for depth, distance, and clear differences between areas only tens of yards apart. For the first time, the story of the V-shaped barrier existed not just as talk or feeling, but as a set of measurable, comparable, verifiable facts. The neighbors watching from afar recognized that without anyone saying it, no one declared Elias right, because a medium-sized slide could still be chalked up to luck, but no one laughed anymore. Laughter, which came easily when nothing could be weighed, vanished before carefully recorded numbers and undeniable physical traces. Elias took no part in the process. He did not direct Margaret where to measure, did not explain what she saw, and did not ask her to share conclusions. He only stood for a while on his cabin porch, watched her write, then went back inside, as if understanding that from this moment, the story had begun leaving the realm of personal experience and taking on the weight of truth the mountain had just left behind. The silence following Margaret's measurements did not lead to consensus, but settled into an unresolved skepticism. In the days that followed, as the valley gradually returned to its usual rhythm, conversations began veering into the familiar paths people take when facing something not yet large enough to force them to abandon old beliefs. Some said the recent slide was just a small early season one, the kind that happened almost every year, and that if snow really built up thicker, that V-shaped barrier would be no different from a meaningless obstacle. Others argued the snow splitting was due to a timely wind shift, that a strong cross gust was enough to deflect the entire sliding mass, and crediting a wooden structure was overreaching. In those talks, Elias's name was mentioned, not with admiration but in a warning tone that he was gambling his life on an idea not tested long enough. Caleb Monroe spoke the loudest among them. He openly called the V-shaped barrier a fluke, a favorable coincidence rather than the result of calculation. To him, Elias was not only testing his own luck but creating a false sense of security that could make others complacent when the real big slide came. Those words were spoken not in anger, but with the certainty of someone who believed years of living with mountains were enough to dismiss a single exception. Elias heard it all, since the valley was not wide enough for any gossip to vanish, but he did not respond. He did not argue, did not offer more diagrams or numbers, and did not try to prove his barrier would hold in every scenario. He continued his routine as before, checking the structure each morning, clearing snow from paths, and preparing for colder days ahead, as if understanding that any defense now would only dilute the one thing of value, the outcome when nature spoke next. Margaret Hale did not join those debates either. She kept recording weather regularly, but after the first slide, her notebook pages began including a separate section for the area around the V-shaped barrier, where she noted snowfall amounts, wind directions, and changes in the snowpack on the slope above Elias's cabin. Yet Margaret made no announcements. She drew no conclusions, shared no data with the community, and did not say what she saw was enough to affirm anything. Those records lay quiet in her book, accumulating slowly like the snow layers building up high, keeping skepticism intact and social conflict unresolved, ready for a greater challenge forming ahead. After the days of lingering doubt without vanishing, winter began pressing the valley in a slow but unrelenting way. Snow did not fall in decisive big storms, but continuously, layer upon layer, day after day, enough to cover old traces but not enough to release the pressure building on the slope. Temperatures hovered around the dangerous threshold, rising just enough by day to soften the top layer, dropping deep at night to freeze everything again, creating hard sliding surfaces sandwiched between new loose layers that had not bonded. Up high, wind blew without stop, carrying snow from exposed ridges to build thick heavy cornices hanging like debts not yet due but certain to be paid. Margaret Hale recognized the shift through familiar numbers in her records. When she dug small snow pits on the slope above the valley, the layers showed clearly, separate, not clinging to each other, as in more stable seasons. She noted slick surfaces, weak layers beneath fresh ones, and marked in her book conditions she knew, though rarely named aloud, were leading to a more dangerous type. Slab avalanche, when an entire large slab could release at once instead of slowing gradually. Margaret made no public findings, but her caution increased. Records grew denser, more detailed, dates circled in bold strokes. In the valley, the community sensed the pressure more instinctively. People began limiting outings to essentials, shifting firewood chopping to safer hours, avoiding slopes once considered familiar. No one spoke directly of what was coming, but quiet preparations appeared. Doors reinforced further, escape paths cleared, families keeping essentials in easy reach. That was how people prepared for the thing they did not want to think about without naming it. Elias was not outside that buildup, but his response differed from the rest. Each morning he circled the V-shaped barrier, checking each post, each joint, shaking them by hand to feel solidity in the frozen ground. He cleared snow from accumulation points, ensuring the apex stayed free in a way that preserved the original angle, reinforcing spots designed for load, but he did not expand the structure, add wings or adjust the V angle for extra reassurance. To Elias, the barrier's rightness or wrongness lay not in looking stronger each day, but in whether it did what was calculated when snow truly moved. Any change now would only muddy the one test that mattered. He accepted the waiting as part of the choice made. While snow kept falling, wind kept building high, and the whole valley lived in suspension, where no one mocked anymore. But no one yet dared believe the biggest test was passed. The pressure winter built finally found release, and when it happened, no one in the valley could mistake it for an ordinary slide. The second avalanche started much higher than the first. From ridges where wind had packed snow for weeks into thick, heavy, taut slabs, it did not begin at a single point, but at multiple spots almost simultaneously, as an entire weak layer system released from the hard bed below, unleashing a volume far greater than anything the valley had seen in years. The sound this time was not a prolonged deep growl but a series of pounding roars, as if the mountain was breaking from within, merging into one continuous boom that shook the air. Those still outside immediately sought the safest direction they knew, while those inside cabins felt the ground shake underfoot, not sharp jolts but heavy waves through frozen earth. Snow rushed down multiple paths at once, carrying trees, rocks, and ice chunks torn from the slope, merging into white torrents flooding the valley with speed and mass that made prior comparisons meaningless. On the northern edge, another lower cabin with no deflection structure took the first direct hit. The mass struck the log wall head-on, without slowing or diverting, and in seconds snapped one corner, crushed the front porch, and shoved the whole building off its foundation. The occupants escaped by inches through a side door blown open, crawling from wreckage as snow overran the rest, leaving a cold void where the house had stood. That scene was close enough for those near Elias to know this was no gentle test. The main flow continued straight toward Elias's area, larger, faster, heavier than before. The sound echoed like an invisible wall, ground vibrating clearly with each pulse of the moving mass. Elias's V-shaped barrier took the direct initial impact, and in the opening moments snow surged high near the apex peak, as if the entire volume would spill over and sweep everything behind. Posts shuddered under pressure, snow compacted against the structure, white powder exploding into air as the slide hit the apex with force enough to bend nearby branches. Then the flow began to change. Instead of continuing to concentrate force at the center, the mass was forced sideways, large portions sliding along the two arms, splitting into two distinct streams. Energy did not disappear but was stretched and dispersed across space, each stream carrying only part of the original momentum. Snow kept pouring down, high and thick, but the two streams no longer converged behind the apex. They hugged the structure sides, past the cabin area, and continued down the valley on diverging paths. Elias stayed inside the cabin throughout. He did not run. There was nowhere to run when the whole valley lay in the path, and because he knew any movement now was pointless, he stood in the tight space, feeling each wave transmit through the floor, hearing snow strike the barrier then slide aside, hearing the sound split into two separate branches instead of one unified roar. When snow rose past windows and outside light was blocked by white walls, Elias did not think about being right or wrong or the earlier laughter. He only stood waiting to see if what he had learned, calculated, and built was honest enough to physics to survive this trial. When the sound began fading, not abruptly but gradually like retreating waves, the ground stopped shaking and air returned to familiar heaviness. Elias waited longer, certain the main flow had passed. Only then did he step outside and see the result. Two enormous snowbanks taller than a person running along either side of the V-shaped barrier, clear evidence of two massive diverted streams, and the space immediately behind the apex where his cabin stood, still there, surrounded but uncrushed. As the sound of the second avalanche faded and the valley gradually emerged in the gray light of winter morning, its aftermath began revealing itself slowly but mercilessly, layer by layer, like the snow that had poured down. Trails connecting cabins were severed at many points, not just by high drifts but by concrete hard compacted blocks, where powder had been squeezed so tight a shovel only scratched the surface. Some once safe paths vanished entirely under new slide banks, making the already isolated valley even more divided. More critically, many cabins sat near secondary slide paths, smaller branches that could release any time as upper snow remained unstable. That left part of the community, though not directly hit, hanging in danger, unable to leave yet unable to stay with peace. In those homes were elderly and children, unable to cross deep snow alone or endure long exposure. Temperatures inside dropped fast as windows cracked under snow pressure or new gaps appeared after shaking, letting cold wind in unchecked. Fires, prepared for a normal winter, could not offset heat loss in spaces invaded by wind and ice. Children shivered even wrapped in layers. Elderly breathed heavily in biting air that tightened their lungs with each gasp. No one thought any more about debating whether the V-shaped barrier was right or wrong, or who had predicted what. Talk now revolved only around far more urgent questions: which homes still stood, which were partly buried, and whether another slide hung overhead. Panic spread not in shouts but in hurried, fragmented decisions as families moved the weakest to inner rooms, sealed what they could, and burned extra wood knowing reserves would not last if this continued. Some tried clearing temporary paths with shovels and saws but quickly realized they faced snow beyond human strength, each dig only exposing more hard cold surface. Isolation made fear spread faster than any rumor, because in the valley now, not seeing neighbors no longer meant all was well, it could mean someone was buried under the fresh flow. Elias was not the only one still standing after the slide, but his cabin sat in a rare spot not immediately threatened by secondary branches. That drew many eyes toward him, not with admiration but with quiet hope that one place could hold out longer than ours. Meanwhile, Margaret Hale moved from cabin to cabin within reach, noting trail conditions, indoor temperatures, and numbers trapped. but she knew numbers this time were not enough to reassure. The valley had entered a different winter phase, where measurements and arguments were pushed aside by the simple life or death question: who was still alive and who would be buried next if snow shifted again. That tension did not erupt into chaos but hung like cold fog, forcing everyone to face that from now on, any decision carried immediate consequences. Cut trails, cabins in secondary danger, people unable to evacuate, and deepening cold had turned the story from a technical experiment into a community crisis, leaving no room for hesitation or denial, where each passing hour could decide the line between survival and burial, under layers still refusing to settle. When it became clear the valley could not wait another day for things to stabilize on their own, Elias opened his cabin door without anyone needing to knock. He did not call it a shelter, did not offer grand reassurances, simply cleared space inside, pushed tables and chairs against walls, spread extra blankets, and divided sleeping areas into small zones for better warmth. The first trapped arrived in silence, trudging heavily through deep snow, carrying tightly wrapped children and elderly struggling to breathe in the cold. Elias welcomed them as if it were obvious, guiding them in, showing where to set belongings, seats near the stove, spots away from drafts, everything done with calm that eased others' panic. As the cabin filled, he spoke more, not about his own V-shaped barrier, but about what could be done in the next hours to reduce risk for the rest of the community. He explained building temporary barriers from boards, logs, anything available, angled off the slope instead of perpendicular to deflect snow, if smaller releases came. He showed digging shallow trenches to guide snow aside from paths, preventing dangerous compaction near doors. He stressed staying clear of clearly formed runout zones after the recent slide, even if familiar trails or once safe ground, because snow cared nothing for habits or memories. Those instructions were not theoretical but tied to specific actions, visible positions on the slope, making listeners understand this was no time to debate, but to follow what might help survive the night. Among those coming to Elias's cabin was Caleb Monroe. He arrived later, coat covered in snow, face weary with no trace of sarcasm left. Caleb offered no apology, mentioned nothing of past words. He only stood a moment, looked around the crowded but warmer space, then asked one short, direct question: how? Elias did not answer at length. He handed Caleb a shovel, pointed out main wind direction, accumulating snow spots, and where to place temporary deflectors. The change in how Caleb listened, attentive, uninterrupted, was the clearest proof roles in the valley had shifted. No one stood above to judge, only people ready to follow anything with a chance to help the community through. Margaret Hale witnessed it all from a cabin corner, not recording immediately as usual, but helping serve warm water and settle children near the stove. When she began noting events, it was not just data or observations, but the sequence of emergency decisions, applied guidance, and immediate results. Outside the cabin, in dim winter afternoon light, temporary barriers rose at key spots, rough, imperfect, but enough to create paths slowing or diverting snow as small slabs continued releasing from above. Those who once argued now worked side by side in silence, sharing tools and effort, knowing any delay could let cold claim another home. Elias moved between groups, quickly checking temporary structures, adjusting angles, reminding of safe distances, then returning to the cabin to ensure the weakest stayed warm. He did not play hero, did not stand center giving orders, but acted as a technical and moral anchor people could turn to for clear answers. Night brought deeper cold, but in the valley now panic had given way to fragile order, built on concrete action and newly formed trust. Rescue and deflection happened not in explosive moments, but in hours of steady work, where each temporary barrier, each dug trench, each person moved to warmth, pulled the community one step farther from the life-death edge they had just touched. As the first night passed without another major slide, the atmosphere in Elias's cabin eased enough for people to ask not from fear but from need to understand. Elias did not stand like a teacher, did not try to systematize his knowledge into lessons, but crouched near the door where snow had been packed flat, and began explaining using what was right in front. He pulled a dry branch, drew simple lines on the snow surface, mimicking the slope, valley, and usual slide starts. He used handfuls of dirt-mixed ice to form a mass, pushed it down the drawn path, showing everyone how it accelerated, spread, and sought easiest routes instead of crashing straight into hard obstacles. No terms, no long explanations, just short sentences tied to visible images. Elias said snow does not think but always chooses the path of least resistance, and human task is not blocking that flow head on, but making it choose another direction. He pointed out reading terrain by eye, finding depressions, smooth steep faces where snow had slid before, lower areas where it would stop and compact. He guided recognizing old paths even under fresh cover through differences in compaction and snow color. When speaking of the V-angle, Elias gave no fixed numbers but described it as a compromise between slope steepness, expected snow volume, and protected space behind. He drew the two opening arms, explaining too narrow left no room for splitting flow, too wide failed to break impact in time. Those sitting around did not argue, did not challenge with questions, but quietly absorbed what they saw and heard. Some used sticks to redraw Elias's diagrams outside on snow, mentally applying them to spots around their own cabins. Margaret Hale recorded carefully, not just words but the sequence Elias used to approach problems, from observation to action, knowing the knowledge's value now lay in recreating it elsewhere, not memorizing technical details. Caleb Monroe sat silent, gripping a small notebook, jotting key points without looking up, as if fearing missing a moment could cost something vital in coming days. No one in the room thought they were learning a new technique. They understood they were being shared a way of seeing, a survival method proven not by theory, but by still breathing in the cold outside. When Elias finished, he scuffed over the snow drawings with his foot, as if reminding that these illustrations existed only momentarily, and what mattered was how each person carried them back to their own terrain and home. As winter continued tightening the valley, but without the surprise blows as before, signs of change began appearing quietly but collectively. V-shaped barriers were no longer solitary before Elias's cabin, but gradually appeared scattered at key spots across the valley, before homes near old slide paths, along trails often overrun, around woodsheds needing to protect precious fuel from burial or sweep away. They were not identical, each person adjusting opening angle, height, and materials to what they had, but the principle stayed consistent: split flow, deflect force, create clear space behind. No one called them Elias's invention when building. People just said it was the most effective way they knew now. Margaret Hale played a central role in the spread, not through speeches or commands, but by compiling her records into clear handwritten summaries, copied for neighboring valleys on rare trips when weather allowed. She noted barrier positions, placement angles, results after minor snow events, and early failures when placed wrong direction or too close to protected areas. Those notes carried no scientific tone, but like messages among mountain dwellers, focused on what kept them safe and what did not. When groups from nearby areas visited, they heard no one recall the initial laughter when Elias first drove stakes. Instead, brief exchanges about distances, reading slope signs, and where to place barriers without creating new hazards. The method quickly became what everyone knew, without formal name or standardized document, because it was reinforced each time a V-shaped barrier did what was expected, made snow go around instead of straight into where people lived. Those once skeptical now built their own without prompting, and newcomers were guided from the start. As natural part of learning to live here, standardization came not from authority decision or individual claim, but from repeated experiences long enough to turn one specific solution into shared habit. In the valley, the V-shaped barrier was no longer symbol of an odd idea, but part of the winter landscape, quietly present where most needed, reminding that shared and tested knowledge finds its own way to endure, even when no one remembers the moment it was once mocked. When spring finally filtered into the valley, it did not arrive with fanfare or instant relief, but through slow, irreversible signs. Early sun softened snow on slopes bit by bit, exposing old slide scars as long marks following terrain, two parallel flows where snow had been split and forced around, leaving a clear middle like a silent reminder of what happened. V-shaped barriers emerged gradually under melting ice, chipped, bent, scarred by impacts, but most still standing, rooted deep in ground that held them as tons passed. Elias saw it all like others, not with triumph, but as a completed test. No one in the valley called him hero, organized thanks, or built a tale of victory. When people sought him, it was not to praise but to ask very specific, practical questions. What angle splits flow enough? How far from house avoids back pressure? How deep post to keep from popping under compaction? Elias answered briefly, sometimes leading the asker out to point at dried slide marks and impact-scarred posts, letting answers lie in what they could see and touch. The valley returned to old rhythms, but not quite as before, because new structures were built with different understanding of winter and its movement. No formal summary, no lesson posted as reminder, just small but lasting changes in how people trusted what they built. And in that spring landscape, amid wet earth and emerging grass, V-shaped barriers stood quietly as part of the new terrain, needing no one to recall early laughter or past arguments. In places where snow needs no reason to kill, things once called foolish are sometimes simply those that understood winter better than people, and thus remained when everything else had to go. If you appreciate stories of survival knowledge tested by harsh reality rather than words, please subscribe so you do not miss the next ones. Thank you for joining, and see you in the next telling.